We're now in the age of streaming services. And what that means for television is that there are tons of shows popping up on a weekly basis. Some are good, some are bad. And that raises a question. And that question is, how do we as an audience determine if a show is worth our time to stay through the final episode, let alone the final season? What we're going to do is we're going to get into that today because I'm going to go over my personal method that I use to determine if I'm going to stick with the show or pretty much toss it into my what the fuck is this bullshit category. And with that said, my name is Lincoln. This is the RPG show, and let's get into it. Now, to determine the value of a show, this will be different for everyone, but there are core elements that should always exist within the first 3 episodes of any show. This is where we get into my personal method that I use to determine the value of a show, which I call the 3 episode hook, which means by the third episode, I need to be hooked and reeled in if I'm going to continue this show. Let's start with number one, the introduction of the protagonist. This has to be done in a memorable way. Now, this will be different depending on the show. And the one thing that matters, though, is that by the end of episode 3, we as an audience feel that the protagonist is an absolute badass. And he is capable and has the tendency or possibility to do everything that he needs to do to get to the end of his journey. The proverbial speak softly and carry a big stick type of mentality. Now, this doesn't mean the protagonist has to be a physical badass. He or she can be an intellectual badass, hell, even a comedical badass. But the point is that the main character has to be good at what he does or what she does in order to maintain the appearance of being that strong protagonist that the audience views him as. This needs to also be displayed within the first 3 episodes so that the audience can get a feel for it and settle in on it. Now, a good example would be the way Frank Castle was introduced in Daredevil in season 2. Frank, he's a very interesting case because he is neither a antagonist nor a protagonist by nature. With his introduction, the show would appear he would be the antagonist. But throughout the season, we found out his motivations and we began to empathize with him. And at that point, he is no longer considered the antagonist, but he has become the protagonist. We as the audience are now pulling for Frank to have a more favorable outcome by the end of the show. The scene of his introduction, the hospital scene, this made such an impact and it set the tone for the rest of the season. His walk down the hallway of the hospital, it was intense and it was suspenseful. The only thing that we see in the first shot are his feet and a steady pace that he walks at. This was done to show just how intense and determined Frank is. His pace never slows, never stumbles, and his stride never stops. This will be important for later on in the scene, which further establishes how Frank sees himself as pretty much an unstoppable force. We are then presented with a rear shot of Frank Castle walking away. This is done to put the audience in his shoes. We see him walking, and it's a tight shot. This shot indicates that we are right there with him. We're seeing it from his perspective, but as a passenger, sort of like a third-person video game at this point. We still haven't seen his face. The only thing we've seen is his movement and his actions. The camera then switches to a medium waist hot shot, where we see Frank carrying a pump action shotgun. This brings us back to the beginning shot, where all we see is Frank's pace, his feet, his speed, his pace. He never stumbles and he never stops and he never shudders his feet, even all while carrying a shotgun hanging from his hip. He is there for one thing, and he's going to do it no matter who or what gets in his way, like the unstoppable force that he knows that he is. This was an absolutely brilliant introduction to his character. And we're going to go into number 2. The motivations and the tone of the show have to be clear. We need to understand why things are happening so that we can push the narrative forward. There have been so many shows that pretty much lead to nowhere after the first 3 episodes. This leads to the audience feeling confused about the plot, confused about the tone, and the motivations of the show. By episode 3, something needs to happen to leave the audience wanting more. Currently, I'm watching the show on Amazon Prime, Reacher, and I have to say this show is much more interesting than I thought it was going to be. It contains all elements of both number 1 and number 2. The show establishes the protagonist in a well-written way, and it also sets the tone properly for what the show is going for. This show takes the audience on a scavenger hunt, basically for clues, by dropping subtle hints throughout the episode. So we will understand the motivation of the protagonist and the show. We see the breadcrumbs and we try to connect the dots alongside the cast. And it's very interesting to see clues and hints drop throughout the episode that we as audience members put together and piece together before the cast does. I absolutely love that kind of writing. By episode 3, we are left with an outcome that leaves us wanting more.
Everyone's always jealous. I'm gonna uncover this whole operation and burn it to the ground.
Number 3, if you adapt a TV show or movie from any other source of media and the main character has specific traits, whether it be genetically or financially, things that make the person who he or she is, and that's part of his DNA of the writing of the character, then you need to cast the role accordingly. Case in point, Jack Reacher. From 2012, this starred Tom Cruise. His portrayal didn't go over well with the fans of the book. For those of you who didn't know, Jack Reacher is a character written by Lee Childs in a series of novels dated from 2012 to 2016. The movie from 2012 got a bunch of heat from the fans because of the clear description of Reacher in the novels as being an extremely tall man, an extremely broad-shouldered man with long arms, long legs, and long torso. And at 5'7", Tom Cruise just ain't it, Chief. This is coming from the man himself, Lee Childs, in an interview that he did a while back. Take a listen.
And I loved the first 2 movies. I thought they were terrific. But ultimately, the readers felt he was not an accurate representation of Reacher. And I've got to defer to the readers. You know, the readers are the most important people to me.
And why was that? What were they saying?
Well, he's too small. You know, Reacher is a huge, hulking, scary brute. If Reacher walks in the room, the temperature just drops a degree, and people are a little, worried.
Point number 4. This is the final point. There has to be stakes and consequences. We as the audience should feel on edge during the show. Writing that gets you emotionally attached to a show generally keeps the retention factor very high throughout the season. Nothing sets you on edge like a great antagonist. At some point during the first 2 episodes, the villain needs to be introduced, either in a subtle introduction or a grandiose one. Either way, the villain's presence, it should be noted and introduced in a fashion so that he or she is perceived as a threat to not only the hero, but the story itself.
Let's put a smile on that face.
All right, guys, that's it for this video. These are just some things that I look for in a show to determine if I want to stick around or not. They're not the end-all, be-all factors, but they've been reliable for me, and I do hope they'll be reliable for you in the future. Thanks for watching. My name is Lincoln. This is the RPG Show, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.